What if the biggest thing stopping hateful ideologies isn't some grand moral principle, but just cold, hard economic self-interest? Today, we're diving into a fascinating paper by Farron that puts that very counterintuitive idea to the ultimate test. It all comes down to this really simple but powerful statement. You see, holding a prejudice, just a belief inside your own head, that doesn't cost you a thing. But the second you act on that prejudice in the real world, well, that's when it starts to cost you. If you refuse to hire the best person for the job or refuse to sell to the highest bidder because of their background, you're taking a real economic hit. You've just made yourself less competitive. All right, so here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll unpack the basic theory of why discrimination is expensive. Then, we're going to take that theory and apply it to the most extreme test case you can possibly imagine, Nazi Germany. We'll look at the shocking resistance the regime actually faced, see how the state was forced to keep upping the pressure, and we'll finish with the author's, well, let's just say it's a very provocative final thought. Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the cost of discrimination, or you could call it why your wallet often disagrees with your ideology. So, this is the basic idea, right? If you run a business and you hire your less qualified cousin instead of a super skilled applicant, your competitor who hires that skilled person gets an instant leg up. The constant pressure of the market just pushes everyone, whether they like it or not, to find the best value, the best talent. It's not about being a good person. It's just about pure, simple efficiency. And that leads to the really crucial question. This theory sounds great on paper, in a free market. But what happens when an entire state, a government with absolute power, makes discrimination its #1 central goal? Can that quiet, individual force of economic self-interest still put up a fight? Or does ideology just steamroll right over it? And that brings us to our ultimate test case, Nazi Germany. Now, it's really, really important to get this next part. The regime itself didn't just frame its so-called Jewish problem in terms of hate. No, they framed it in very specific economic and professional terms. And look, this wasn't some new idea they invented. The paper makes it super clear that this narrative of economic grievance had been brewing in Germany for decades. This quote, from all the way back in 1879, frames the whole thing not just as racial hatred, but as a fight for economic and professional control. And Hitler himself, he used this exact same logic to sell the Nuremberg laws in 1935. He didn't just stand up and scream hate. He presented the laws as a pro-German move, a way to fix what he called a huge overrepresentation of Jewish people, who were less than 1% of the population in the country's top jobs. And you know, this thinking was incredibly common. The paper points out that even guys who were considered non-ideologues, people like Albert Speer and Hjalmar Schacht, they saw this as a pretty reasonable goal. To them, cutting back Jewish influence to match their small share of the population just seemed like a sensible pro-German policy. So you had a society that, on a large scale, pretty much supported this discrimination. Now, Section 3. This is where it gets really interesting. Surprising economic resistance. Because if everyone basically agreed on the goal, you'd think it would be easy to achieve, right? Well, not so fast. So that's the big puzzle, isn't it? If the government and a huge chunk of the population wanted this, why was it so incredibly hard to actually push Jewish professionals out of their jobs? Why didn't people just go along with it? Well, the answer starts to show up when you look at the cold, hard data. Just check out this table from the source. Even after all the initial violence and official bans, by the middle of 1933, Jewish lawyers still made up over 16% of all lawyers in Germany. That's 22 times their share of the population. Doctors, a similar story. The numbers were going down, but man, was it slow. But this next number is the one that really just stops you in your tracks. In 1937, 4 full years into Nazi rule, after the Nuremberg laws, after unbelievable social and legal pressure, a staggering 55% of the Jewish lawyers who were practicing back in 1933 were still working. Think about that. How is that even possible? The explanation is found in these little anecdotes from the source, and they show individual self-interest in action. You had civil servants, the people who were supposed to be the model citizens, still going to their trusted Jewish doctors. You had card-carrying Nazi party members showing up on the patient lists of Jewish physicians. I mean, get this, the paper even notes that Hitler's own mistress, Eva Braun, was treated by a Jewish doctor. On an individual level, when it came down to their own health or their own legal troubles, people were making a simple, rational choice. I want the best person for the job, and they were willing to ignore the state's ideology to get it. So the state realized something pretty quick. They couldn't just rely on popular opinion to get this done. And that brings us to Section 4, escalating state pressure. The paper's argument here is fascinating. All that increasing radicalization, it wasn't just part of the plan. It was a direct reaction to the fact that ordinary people just weren't complying. You can almost see it as a ladder they had to keep climbing. They started in 33 with boycotts and professional bans, but that didn't fully work because people just found ways around it. So then in 35, they brought in the massive legal barriers of the Nuremberg laws. When that still wasn't enough, they resorted to public shaming and more violence. And only then, finally, in 1938, 5 years into this thing, did they go for a total state-enforced ban. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the state had to keep raising the price, the cost of doing business with a Jewish person. They had to make it socially dangerous, then legally impossible, and finally physically risky. The escalating brutality, according to this paper's logic, wasn't just ideology on autopilot. It was a weapon they had to keep sharpening to fight against this incredibly powerful and stubborn force of individual self-interest. And that brings us to the final, and maybe the most challenging part of this whole analysis. Section 5, the author's final thought. Can a motive we usually just call greed actually be a good thing for society? This is where the whole thing just flips conventional wisdom right on its head. The author, Stephen Farron, comes to this really stark conclusion. He suggests that this tendency for our own self-interest to override our ideologies, maybe that isn't a human flaw. Maybe it's our most socially valuable characteristic. Maybe it's the thing that saves us from our own worst collective passions. And here's the argument in a nutshell. People who are driven by profit have to, by definition, provide products and services that other people actually value. He argues that if the great tyrants of the 20th century had been motivated by greed instead of ideology, if they had just been capitalists who only cared about making money, they would have been building businesses to serve people, not building camps to murder them. And so that's the idea we're left with. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable but really important question. Can the pursuit of self-interest, a force we so often see as selfish or amoral, actually be one of the most powerful, practical defenses a society has against its most dangerous and inhuman impulses? It's a challenging idea, and definitely one worth thinking about.